momentarily. Great. We are now live. I'm Rick Hansen here with Marie Forleo, and I was just saying before we went live how much I appreciate you, Marie. As I've been on your show and I've seen your work, and I am really struck by the ways in which, for someone as effective and successful as you are, it's so clear to me that at the heart of it all, you want to help people, and that's what fundamentally motivates you. So I'm pleased to be able to do this with you right now and share you with other people. And thank you for having this Facebook Live conversation with me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. As you know, I've talked about on my show lots of times, I'm such a huge fan of your work. I'm such a huge fan of the concepts and the tools and the messages that you share. And it's great to be with people. This is part of what I love about the internet is we get to connect with so many folks all around the world.
Yeah, that's great. So we have a mutual love fest that seems, I think, really genuine. It is really genuine on both sides. And so just to kind of set it up here, you have written a book that kind of summarizes a lot of the material of yours. Everything is figureoutable. So could you show us the cover? Because I think the cover itself tells the tale. That's you.
It's fun.
Yeah. And so I wondered if in this current time of Corona, you could talk a little bit about what do you mean by figureoutable, including really tough conditions. You've grown up with some tough conditions that you had to deal with yourself. And so just in general, what is the basic idea here that everything is figureoutable, and why is it important to appreciate that everything is figureoutable?
You know, it's an idea that my mom really passed along to me when I was a little girl. And it was this notion that you can do virtually anything you set your mind to. If you roll up your sleeves, you get in there and you're willing to get messy and dirty and create or make a way ahead. And I saw her do this in physical ways. And, my mom grew up in poverty. So I just found her always moving through life, not being stopped by a lack of money or a lack of know-how, a lack of education, any of those things. And so this grounding belief for me really means that everything that is important to us, if we want to bad enough, we can find or make a way to transcend or transform any challenge that we face. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we can change an exterior circumstance, but we have the ability to change ourselves and to find a way to meet our circumstances with grace and resilience and creativity and compassion and love. And in doing that, I find oftentimes, not only do we change, but the circumstances themselves seem to be different. Yeah. And so it is a way to ground ourselves in our very unique human ability to go, okay, here's a challenge, and I get to choose how I want to show up to meet that challenge. So for me, it's a philosophy, it's a lifestyle, and it keeps bringing us back to our strength and our ingenuity and our ability to rise.
That's so great. As a psychologist, there are these fundamental ideas that I think are really important to kind of dust off, and it gives us a way of appreciating the profundity, really, of what you're saying here. Notions like agency, the sense of having personal agency or efficacy rather than learned helplessness. And an overlapping, classic, maybe this will take you back to your college classes in psychology, I don't know, internal locus of control rather than external locus of control. And the ways in which a sense of personal agency that's authentic, that understands what is like the serenity prayer beyond our control, while focusing on what is within our influence, notably in particular, our own thoughts and feelings, our own reactions to things, right? So the value of agency and also the value of internal locus of control, focusing on what you can do yourself rather than feeling just helpless and swept along by external forces. Both of them are huge factors of mental health, as well as effectiveness in the world. So I want to underline some of what you're saying here.
Yeah, when I was first starting to share the book, I had folks going, are you saying though everything is figure outable? What about really, the big things in life? What about things like addiction or grief or the loss of someone that you love? And I was like, I'm still going to stand by my idea. And here's why. The first time I had floated this concept and philosophy out beyond my own audience was on Oprah's stage. She was having this event that was called Super Soul Sessions. And I was blessed enough to be able to do a talk during that event. And so after that event was done, the notion of everything was figure outable was shared through her podcast. And so it was reaching a different audience than I had ever reached before, Rick. And so I started receiving letters from people who had never been familiar with my work. I had never worked with them in any of our training programs, didn't know me from Eve. And one woman sent in a letter to me and she said, Marie, thank you so much for that talk that you gave on Oprah. This was a lesson that my mom has been always trying to teach me. And it was so good. We actually sat down and we listened to the talk together. She said, but then suddenly something happened. My beautiful mom, who's like my best friend in the whole world, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And suddenly nothing seemed figure outable. She said, but when I stepped back and I looked more deeply at the situation, here's what I discovered. I could figure out how to get nursing care for my mom who lived in a rural area. I could figure out how to find foods that she could tolerate. And this was the big one for Jen. She said, I could figure out how to get medical equipment so my beautiful mom could spend her last days, and in fact, what turned out to be her last 5 weeks on earth, being exactly where she wanted to be, which was in her own home. So Jen said, it turns out I can say for myself, everything really is figure outable. And thank you so much for making a big difference to two women living on the other side of the world. They were living in New Zealand. And so we have countless stories like that where folks are up against some of the most difficult circumstances that we human beings face. And they took this little phrase and they used it for themselves to find a sense of grace and strength and hope to meet these difficult circumstances from a place of personal power.
Yeah, that's extremely touching. And I wonder if you could give an example that's a little different. And in that example, the target, in a sense, of figuring out were these external conditions that were really important to arrange and so forth. All that's legitimate. Can you give us an example of a situation where the external conditions cannot be figured out?
Yes.
There's no improvement possible. They are what they are. Before we went online here, we were talking about the recent murder of an African-American man by the police in Minneapolis, which has outraged many police chiefs around the country.
Big Floyd, George Floyd, yes.
Yeah, George Floyd. And so that's something that is what it is. But even from one of your examples, maybe people have shared with you, where you can't change the conditions, but what you can figure out is your reactions to them.
Absolutely. So there was a mom who has a beautiful daughter who, like me, loved to dance. And so for her entire childhood, she was competing in dance competitions, and dance was like the most important thing in her daughter's life. It's what gave her life. It's what motivated her.
Yeah.
And as she was growing older, they discovered there was something up with her spine. Something wasn't right. And after going through a series of tests and diagnosis and all kinds of treatments, it came to be that the daughter needed to have a surgery that was going to fuse together her vertebrae and essentially put like a bar in her back, because that's what was necessary. And that meant her daughter would never be able to dance again in the way that she was used to. And so this was a situation that was not going to change. This was what it was. They had done everything they possibly could. And the mother, Tatiana, she wrote to me and said that she was spending months and months crying herself to sleep. And she was so angry and she felt so helpless as a mom because she couldn't do anything to help her daughter, and just watching her daughter's life, about to change permanently from this thing that she loved. And so it was really difficult. And so she said she was scrolling on her phone one night and she came across Everything's Figure Outable, and she was like, didn't want to look at it at first. And then she listened to it and watched it, and as she started to absorb that idea for herself, she realized what she could figure out was not how to change the situation because the surgery was going to happen and her daughter's life was going to change. But she figured out that it wasn't about her daughter living a particular life that she wanted for her daughter. It was, how can I support my daughter in having the most beautiful life possible, including these circumstances? That's what I can figure out. I can figure out how to show up in a different way, including this. And she said when she shifted around this new reality, that her daughter shifted as well. And that her daughter is like thriving and doing better than she would have ever believed. And I don't think that there's definitely a connection between how her mom was seeing the situation, the energy she was putting out, how she was viewing it, and the pressure she was placing on herself and her daughter, and just figuring out, I was looking at the wrong thing. My job as a mom is to support a beautiful life for my daughter, whatever is inclusive in reality. So I don't know if that hits the mark for you, but that was the one that came to mind.
Yeah, there you're talking about an internal shift of perspective and priorities, and an internal shift of the role of the mother. All of that really valuable. And then out of that, different actions would occur. And
Yeah.
it's funny. I think sometimes what would I say to people at a cocktail party if they ask me, what do I do for a living? So what do you do for a living? And I would say, I ask people questions. Or even more deeply, I might say, I ask people questions they don't always want to answer. As a therapist, right? Sometimes that's the case. So I could push it one step further.
Yeah.
So have you dealt with a situation where there's nothing to do, or there's nothing you can do that's externally directed? It's not even a situation where, let's say you have someone you love, where you can help them find a new path rather than the one, as in the case you just gave, of the path they were heading down, let's say, as a love of dance, where literally you can't help them in any way, or you can't change a circumstance or condition you're in any way. The only place where you can figure things out is inside your own being, inside your own heart, inside your own mind. Can you give us an example of that?
Yes. So there have been several circumstances within like my family life. For example, my mom is estranged from her mom, and it's just been a decades-long split. And for anyone who's ever had, family things where stuff isn't harmonious, it can just be like, it's painful on so many levels. And so for me, the letting go of an idea of how things should be, and these are two adults and they're two human beings and they have their own
This
thoughts
is your grandmother and your mother.
Yeah, absolutely. And just knowing that I have to trust in them, and it's not something I can figure out in a sense where I can figure out how to get them to reconcile, or I can figure out how to help them heal their relationship. So for me, it was about me letting go of my ideas of control, my ideas of how things must be, or this is how families should behave, and to really challenge myself to go, how can I love them individually to my highest possibility with absolutely zero attachment on how they need to interact with each other, if that makes any kind of sense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think of that as one of the most fundamental inner freedoms, to choose to love.
Yes.
To love at will. And sometimes people will say, well, if you deliberately call up loving at will, you're faking something. And to be clear, I'm really talking about if there's a range in any moment in how loving we can be, moving my fingers into the camera here, going to the high end of that range rather than the low end of that range. And maybe sometimes the range is really low. The most loving thing you can do is simply to stay quiet and wish someone well without even letting your face show that you're wishing them well, because they'll have some kind of prickly reaction to that, for example. So there's a loving and will, which for me is twice loving. You're loving, And there's a lovingness in the willfulness of it, the
Yes.
intentionality of it all. And it reminds me actually of a story that's really quite poignant and haunting and extreme. Essentially, it's a true story. A Tibetan monk was imprisoned by the Chinese government, which for me is distinct from the Chinese people and all the rest of that, and tortured and horrible stuff. Just trigger warning, you can imagine the worst of it. Finally, he was released from prison. He's a practicing nonviolent monk, and he made his way eventually to northern India, where he could talk with the Dalai Lama, who was asking him about his experiences. And at one point, the Dalai Lama burst out, hearing about all these terrible hardships and starvation and brutality and the rest of it. He said, did you ever fear for your life? And the monk paused, and he said, well, the only time I really feared for my life was when I felt I was losing my compassion for my captors.
Wow.
Exactly, because that's how he defined his true life, transcended the body. And
Wow.
that was just the heart of it all. And I thought, man, if you can do that in that setting, maybe I can be a little less reactive to some talking head on television or something that happens, in my neighborhood. And anyway, I just wondered if you had a comment about all of that, including this freedom to choose to love.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most difficult places for us as humans to get to. And when we hear stories like this particular monk, or I think about actually going back to the shooting at the church in Charleston a few years ago, African-American church. And I remember watching a news broadcast with some of the folks who had family members that were killed in that shooting, and that they had already forgiven. So they didn't want to have that hate in their heart. And that, for me, relates in that sense of this choosing to love, and this choosing to say, I am going to be the author of how I'm going to paint my life, including these circumstances that are so painful and so tragic and so disturbing on so many levels, but I'm going to show up in response with all the love I can muster. And it really made an impact on me. And there's, anytime you hear a story like that, I think it shows us the possibilities and the depth and the breadth of who we can be.
Well, it's really beautiful. In a funny kind of way, also too, as a psychologist, I guess, or as a therapist or coach or counselor in general, one of the things in this, you function in this way too yourself, right? You're a trainer, you're a coach, you work with people. So one of the things we bump into, you and I and others in the mental health broadly helping profession, is we bump into the ways in which people, to put it a certain kind of way, sometimes don't want to figure it out. Or there's terminology like what's the secondary gain from your way of being, or what's the payoff. I can think of certain situations where I didn't want to figure out a healthy, harmonious, wise path because I was attached to my righteousness, let's say, about it all. I didn't want to figure it out, because that would mean copying to some stuff myself and budging maybe in some ways. And I just wonder if you could speak to maybe even a personal example of something that you didn't want to figure out in terms of some kind of adaptive, flexible, resourceful way of dealing with it, but eventually realized, okay. Figuring it out is the higher road. It's the greater good for myself as well as others. And then down that road.
I mean, this shows up for me. I constantly in relationships. So Josh and I, have been together for 17 years. And there have been many times, I'm trying to think if there's like a specific, because the essence of what you're saying, I'm like, yep. Where he will say, gosh, you're being this way. And I'm like, what are you talking about? No, you're wrong. You're absolutely not. So that righteousness, that self-righteousness, that you don't know what you're seeing or saying or feeling. And I definitely have the right perspective and you have the wrong perspective. And
I'm with you, Marie. I don't know your husband, so I'm on your side of the
it's just, and then and then having the moment where like the emotions kind of calm down for a second. And, I get back in touch with my heart and I'm like, he's 100% right. I just did that. I totally did that. I was not nice. I was mean. I was dismissive. I was, condescending, any of the kind of number of things. I was like, no, that is definitely not true. And so I think the kind of gentleness to be able to listen and to be open to someone else's point of view and to be brave enough and courageous enough to let their point of view in, and then perhaps look for the grain of truth, even if it stings in whatever they're saying. I think for me, it's like, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy?
Yeah.
Do I want to be right or do I want to be connected? Do I want to be right or do I want to be in love? And whenever I catch myself on the side of that righteousness, and I know best and poo-poo and judgment, I know I'm off kilter. Yeah. And I know I'm not being my best. And I know I'm likely out of relationship, and there's no possibility for connection. There's no possibility for healing. My heart, I protect it. It's closed down. You can't even find it. And that's not where I want to live. That's not where I want to live.
Yeah, you make me think about a kind of flow that happens, a sequence. Let's say there you are, kaboom, something happens. You get that call from your doctor, a routine test is worrisome, or somebody says something to you. And for at least a few seconds, and maybe minutes, and sometimes I think hours and days even for people, you're not in a position to figure it out. The best you can do is live through the storm. And it's inappropriate to kind of burden yourself and then think about others where they've gotten the bad news or they're in the situation and we start wagging our finger at them. Hey, this is figureoutable. Start figuring it out. It's really inappropriate. You need to ride out the storm. I think that's really important. But then I'm just thinking there's this crossroads moment where it can feel like a inner conflict sometimes for people, like it's either or, but actually it's kind of both, where you both feel the impact on you and you have the courage to acknowledge your vulnerability in the ways in which you are impacted.
Yes.
Life has scored on you, and that's the way it is in a sense. You have been nailed, while also slowly, if it needs to be, calling yourself to start moving into that agency stance, that internal locus of control stance, that inner directed place where you say, okay, this totally sucks. Darn. Other people should be helping, they're not helping. Or maybe they're helping in some ways, but it's still on me to begin the process from the inside out of figuring it out in a way that doesn't deny the weight of what has landed on someone. The combination of those two. All right. I wonder if you
absolutely. And I think that we talk about this in the book too. When there is something that lands in your lap that is devastating, that is scary, that is disappointing, that you've gotten some type of big rejection or something occurs that's going to change everything, like, this larger experience that we have all been in these past few months. Everything is figureoutable doesn't mean that you have to be a superhero and just go, oh, I don't feel anything and I'm going to move ahead. No, it says, in this moment, I need to actually feel my feelings, and I might need to just cry, or I might need to talk with a friend and just vent and just get it out and like let the emotions be there and be this kind of puddle and pile and afraid mess for a little bit. And I know that I'll get to that other place, maybe in a day or 2 days, but to have the self-compassion and the self-awareness to be able to process your feelings, this, if you can feel it, you can heal it, so that we don't have this backlog in our physical systems, in our mental systems, that can kind of make functioning moving forward somehow dysfunctional because we're trying to move too fast on top of things. And so I think, to your point, both can coexist. We can embrace the fullness of our feelings and our emotion and our humanity in our toughest moments, while knowing that when we're ready to step into that agency, that mindset that, okay, this is really difficult and I can figure out one step to take to start to pull myself ahead. Those things can absolutely coexist. And I think the dance of that is where the real artistry of life comes in, where we live the fullness of our humanity and the fullness of our power at the same time.
You know, it's funny, you're reminding me of this very odd thing that happened to me when I was in high school. I was very young going through school. I was kind of shy, introverted, nervous around other people kind of, guy. And I think I was probably a senior at that point. So I was maybe like 15. I was 15 when I started my senior year. And I was walking down a hallway, and I went to a large high school, 2,700 or so people, West Covina, California. I'm just walking down the hallway, spaced out, probably thinking about some science fiction novel I was reading these days. And suddenly someone walking past me punched me in the stomach.
Whoa. Just
out of the blue. Just belted me. It was one of those passing periods between classes. Punched me in the stomach. I curled over it, caught my breath, straightened up, turned around, 3, 4, 5 seconds had passed, and there was just a sea of heads moving in the other direction. No idea who it was. Like hit and run, belt in the stomach. And what's interesting is in terms of what's figureoutable about that, what in a way there was for me to figure out about it was just a recognition of vulnerability. What there is to figure out is that if I'm going to live in this world, I might get belted in the stomach someday. I can't protect myself against everything. I guess that's a way to put it. Yeah. Be prudent, including in this time of the coronavirus. Be prudent, wear masks, be sensible, if only for the sake of others as well as yourself. Wash your hands as you gestured there. But I think that's part of what is figuring out. It's almost existential, that there's some things that we can't figure out, or there's a limit to our capacity to change things. And there's a certain inherent frailty, I think, in life that we can accept. So it's kind of like figuring out that you can't always figure it out, but you have figured out that you can't always figure it out. And there's a place for just acceptance fundamentally in all of that.
Absolutely. We have 3 simple rules of the figureoutable philosophy in the book that kind of help create a bit of a mental container when you want to take this idea and you want to apply it to an aspiration or a goal or something that you want to learn or experience or achieve. And I'll just run through it quickly because I think it helps put a frame around it. Again, when you are in that space where you're like, oh, there's something I really do want to figure out, and let me see if this is possible. So rule number 1 is all problems or dreams are figureoutable. Rule number 2, if a problem isn't figureoutable, it's not a problem, it's a fact of life or a law of nature, like death or gravity. Yeah. Rule number 3, you may not care enough to solve this particular problem or reach this particular dream, and that's 100% okay. But go find something that you do care so deeply about. And we circle back to rule number 1. And so there was, I was doing research when I was writing the book, and there was this incredible quote by a quantum theorist named David Deutsch, British quantum theorist. And it goes like this: everything that is not forbidden by the laws of nature is achievable given the right knowledge. He wrote a book called The Beginning of Infinity, and it's like a mind bender. I could only partially get through it through audio, but I love that kind of framework because then it helps us aim our attention and our energy in a direction I think that's really aligned with our heart and our creativity and our passion, so that we're like, oh, even if this is a really thorny, interesting, difficult, complex issue, I care so much about it. And I may not be able to figure it out ultimately. There might be a huge social change that you want to see happen in the world, but I can do my part in my lifetime to move us ahead.
Yeah. We're going to be finishing up in a minute or so. And I just wondered if, reflecting on this time, and let's just kind of talk about America, because we both live in America. It's not to leave out the rest of the world. It's not to, ignore let's say the epidemic, the plague that's gradually starting to spread. Now Brazil has the most cases. America had them for a while. Now Brazil has actually nudged past us, even though they have fewer people living in the country. And so if you were to look out there, I even put on your willingness public policy hat at all, if you're willing to stick your neck out at all, I'll do a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think America as the collective is struggling to figure out, and what would be helpful for us as a society to figure out? And the framing for me about this is that what makes us vulnerable to a plague is our profoundly social nature. We live together. Mountain lions are not vulnerable to a plague because they live apart from each other. We are very vulnerable to a plague. So it's only through coming together that we're going to be able to wrap our arms around this, get a grip on it, and then be able to really open up the economy again.
Yes.
With, minimal collateral damage along the way. Okay, great. So we're struggling as a group to figure this out, and all the politics of that. But just boom, if you had one word of advice for us all together, what do you think we ought to figure out?
Well, I think in a micro sense and in a very immediate sense, I do think data and science has told us to wear masks when we're out and about to protect ourselves and others, wash our hands, and to do our best to keep socially distant, to look at the data, especially I look at the ones from New York because I'm a New Yorker, I'm in LA now, but to see that some of the frontline workers actually have a lower infection rate than the general public, even though they're on the front lines dealing with COVID cases every day. So that fact to me, the science of that in a micro sense to help us get through it, I think if we just all wear masks, and I know it has become a political statement, which kind of blows my mind and makes me upset. We'll leave that aside, but wear the masks, clean your hands, and keep socially distant, micro level. Macro level, I would love us to get the big money out of politics.
Yeah.
I think that it is the cause of so many of our ills that then spill over into the tearing apart of our fabric here in America in terms of our food system, our energy system, the banking system, pharmaceuticals. So much of that has an influence, an undue influence on our policy making. So if we could get the money out and then restore voting rights and make it easier for every American to actually vote, I believe those would be enormous steps on a policy level to get us stronger, more connected, and more working collaboratively and collectively as a country.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I vote for you. Okay. Well, wrapping up here, appreciating the people that have joined us and the beautiful comments that have come in.
Yes.
Thank you, Marie. It's been really sweet to do this with you. I really wish you well, and your book's wonderful. It really is. It's sincere, it's solid, it's sustained. I got those 3 S's in there. They're all true. I made them up right now on the spot. Anyway, so you take good care. And
thank you so
blessings
much,
and bows to everyone watching too. Take good care and bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.